Today's notes are going to be on the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The reason we're looking at these two processes comes down to cellular energy. All living things need energy. We talked about that with metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of those chemical reactions that provide energy for an organism. And photosynthesis and cellular respiration are the two processes that organisms are going to get that energy from. And so all energy for living things comes from food. For animals and for fungi, this is in the form of consuming something else. For plants, it's by making it. And almost all the energy in food is going to come from the sun. When it comes to energy use, there are two types of organisms. There are autotrophs and there are heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that can produce their own food. So auto means self and troph means nutrition. So an autotroph is an organism that provides nutrition to themselves by making it. Organisms typically use light energy to produce this food. These are plants, some microorganisms. So autotroph means that they are making their own food. We, as humans and as animals, are not autotrophic. We cannot make our own food from light energy. We must get our energy from consuming something else. Therefore, we are heterotrophs. And a heterotroph is an organism that cannot make their own food. They must consume another organism to get that energy. Hetero means other, troph still means nutrition, so we are getting our nutrition, our nutrients from some other source. We cannot make it ourselves. So we have to consume something else, whether that's other plants or animals, to get the food and the energy that we need. All animals are autotrophic, all fungus is autotrophic, and some bacteria and microorganisms are autotrophic. Now, the reason for all of this is to get cellular energy. Photosynthesis, cellular respiration, both of these processes are happening so that organisms can get cellular energy. And ATP, we've talked about this before, ATP is the energy of the cell. It's that molecule that holds the energy for all life functions. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is a molecule of energy because the energy in ATP is stored in the bonds. And so on your paper where it says blank blank breaks the bonds, this is ATP hydrolysis. That is going to break the bonds and release energy. So you can see here we have the whole molecule ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Water is put into the process, right? That's where we get hydro from, to lyse or break apart this phosphate bond here. So we get this phosphate that's now over on the side, and ADP is our product, which is adenosine diphosphate, because we only have two phosphates, and then energy is a product as well. So this is why we call ATP our cellular energy molecule, because it has energy stored in those bonds that can be released during cellular processes. On the back of your note sheet, there is a table, and we're going to talk about photosynthesis functions, the location, the equations, and reactants and products. And so to start, we're going to look at the function, which is to produce glucose from light energy. That's the whole purpose of photosynthesis, is to produce glucose using light energy. So that's what you should write for the function. Location is, this is happening in the chloroplast, and we've talked about the chloroplast before as a organelle where photosynthesis takes place. The next row is the equation for photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is a chemical reaction. We just talked about that. And so there are things that are going to be going into the process to get certain products. Our reactants, so on the left, you need to write that carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and water, which is H2O, that's the chemical formula, with the presence of light energy, goes to form glucose, which is C6H12O6. It's a huge molecule, plus oxygen, which is O2. Now, you may have noticed there's some sixes before some of these things. And what that tells us is we have to have 6 carbon dioxide molecules, we have to have 6 water molecules with light energy to get 1 glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. So you do need to include the 6s when you're writing this down. And then below that, where it says the reactants, the things on the right, these are the reactants. Okay, so carbon dioxide, water, and light, those are the reactants of photosynthesis. The products are glucose and oxygen. Chlorophyll is the pigment inside the chloroplast that absorbs light. This means that in the chloroplast, in that organelle, chlorophyll is a green pigment that's inside there that's absorbing the light that's needed for photosynthesis. When the light is absorbed by this pigment, all of the light colors are absorbed except green. If you look here, the rainbow of light, right? White light has all of the colors of the rainbow. And when that light hits the chlorophyll, every single color of light is absorbed except green. And so we see here, green is being reflected, and that reflection goes into our eyes, which is why we see plants as being green. During photosynthesis, there are 2 main processes that are occurring. The first is the light-dependent reaction. So as it states, light is required for this reaction to take place. It depends upon light. And so this happens during the daylight. It cannot happen at night. It has to have that light energy. And during the light-dependent reaction, water is broken down, and the light energy is stored temporarily in organic energy carriers like ATP and a molecule called NADPH. The other process during photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle. And during the Calvin cycle, that energy is transferred from the ATP and NADPH to organic compound glucose. So it's a multi-step process. We look at photosynthesis as, light goes in and we take water and carbon dioxide and we produce oxygen and glucose. But there's a lot more to it, where it has to get transferred into ATP, which then gets transferred into the glucose. So you should have filled that in underneath the photosynthesis side on the back of your sheet. This is what that process looks like. You can see that we have the light energy coming in, hitting the chloroplast, and these are called the thylakoids, and these are going to be where that light-dependent reaction takes place. Water has to be present going into that. We're going to get oxygen out of that process, and then that ATP and NADPH is going to be moved into the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide is going to be taken in, and we'll get that glucose out. Sorry about the shifting of my things. When I transfer this from a PowerPoint, it sometimes does that. There are 3 key factors that affect photosynthesis. This is whether or not it will take place and how quickly it will take place and how much ATP and glucose is going to be produced as a result. And one of those is light intensity. So how much light is getting to the leaves and how intense is that light? The most intense light is happening in the summer solstice. The sun is at its highest point in the sky, and we're going to get more direct angles of sunlight on those plants. And that's going to allow for photosynthesis to take place more often and more efficiently because of the high intensity of light. At this time of the year, our days are getting shorter. The sun is at a lower angle in the sky, and so there's just not as much light intensity. And it is not efficient for a plant like trees to continue to go through photosynthesis at the levels that it was in the summer. And we notice that what happens in the fall, but the leaves turn colors because the plant is reabsorbing the chlorophyll, and those leaves are going to drop off the plant. There's not enough of a benefit to the tree to invest energy in producing those leaves because they're not getting enough energy back as a product. It's just not efficient. So we're going to see leaves drop, and those trees are going to kind of go into a state of hibernation where they wait for the sun's intensity to come back in the spring. Another is the carbon dioxide concentration, so how much carbon dioxide is there and is present. As climate change happens and we get more carbon dioxide, there is typically quite a bit around, and that's not going to be a huge issue. And then the temperature. Different temperatures are going to cause photosynthesis to happen at a faster or a slower rate. Now, the other process that happens to get cellular energy is cellular respiration. cellular respiration can be aerobic or anaerobic, and we'll talk about what that means here. But cellular respiration, the function, so this is on your table on the back side of your notes underneath function for cell respiration. The function of cellular respiration is for energy to be released from glucose as ATP. So energy of glucose is released in the body as ATP. So we're transforming that stored energy in our food into cellular energy called ATP so that we can move and breathe and function and do everything that we need to be alive. It should be no surprise to you that the mitochondria is where the process of cellular respiration takes place. We're producing ATP, and we know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell involved in energy production. All right, so on my slide, when I had it on the PowerPoint, it was all nice and laid out, and now it got shifted. So the process, or the chemical equation for cellular respiration is we have glucose on the left, so this is what's being put into the equation. We have glucose and oxygen, and in our mitochondria, when we go through cellular respiration, we produce carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So that's the written form of the equation, but you do need to know the chemical equation with the chemical formulas. So glucose, the formula for glucose is C6H12O6. The chemical formula for oxygen is O2, but we need 6 oxygens with 1 glucose to go through cellular respiration so that we can produce 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, and then we get 36 ATP. So every time that we consume carbohydrates and they get broken down into the glucose, 1 glucose molecule can produce 36 ATP molecules for us, which is a really pretty good system. Then you need to write down reactants, and in this case the reactants are over here, the glucose and the oxygen, and the products are the carbon dioxide, the water, and the ATP. Make sure you're including those numbers with them. Underneath your cellular respiration notes, you will see that we're going to look at cellular respiration and the processes of it. So the first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis. And if you think about the term, it means we have glycose, we take that glucose, and lyse means to break it down. So in glycolysis, this is happening in the cytoplasm. The glucose that our mitochondria, that our cells are taking in is going to be broken down, and we're going to get 2 ATP as a result. It's going to move then into the matrix of the mitochondria and go through what's called the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is also going to produce 2 ATP as a product. The Krebs cycle happens in the presence of oxygen, and then we're going to also move into the electron transport chain. And this is where we get 32 ATP as a product. And this is very efficient, and you can see why if we eliminate the mitochondria and we have non-oxygenated or anaerobic respiration taking place, the ATP yield is so much less. When we have oxygen present, we get so much more ATP out of the process. Underneath where you wrote about aerobic respiration, we're going to look at anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. So we said aerobic, in the presence of oxygen, we're getting certain things, and anaerobic happens when we don't. There are 2 types of anaerobic respiration. We have alcoholic fermentation, and this happens in bacteria and yeast. And we also have lactic acid fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation happens, and the process is going to produce ethyl alcohol, which is how we get beer and everything like that. But it also produces carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is why we get bread to raise, and we have those pockets of air is because of that carbon dioxide that's being produced during the process. So when we add yeast to dough, it's going to help it rise because of that carbon dioxide production. And then we're also going to get carbon dioxide production in beer along with that alcohol in the process. Lactic acid fermentation is going to be something that we're probably all familiar with because it happens in us, in our muscle cells. And lactic acid fermentation happens when our bodies are using glucose so quickly that we can't keep up our oxygen levels with it. So our muscles are using the glucose, but are not doing so in the presence of oxygen. And so as a result, we get lactic acid buildup. And lactic acid is going to cause that burning sensation. So when you're really working hard and your muscles are burning and you feel like you can't go on, that's the production that's happening without the presence of oxygen, because we're using so much oxygen that our bodies can't keep up. And typically what happens when we get a buildup of lactic acid is we're going to feel sore the next couple of days. And that's the presence of that lactic acid in our muscle tissue. Now we're going to fill in this image here on your paper, which is kind of rough, but it should get the job done, to look at the difference between the photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but also how interconnected they are. So the top thing here is a chloroplast, and this is a mitochondria, just to kind of orient you. And then anything else outside is going to be the cytoplasm. We'll start over here with this box on the left, and we know that going into the light reaction is water. So H2O is going into the light reaction, which is awesome because it's also something that's going to be produced by the electron transport chain. Coming out of the light reaction is oxygen. This is how plants produce oxygen, is coming off that light reaction. Those products, the ATP and the NADPH, are going to go into the Calvin cycle, which is going to produce C6H12O6. So we get that glucose, but we had to have carbon dioxide present for that process to take place. And thankfully, again, like we see, the Krebs cycle down here is going to be producing that. So that glucose is going to come down here and be used in the cytoplasm of an animal cell for the process of glycolysis. And remember, glycolysis is going to produce 2 ATP. And this is going to happen in anything, even if it's going through anaerobic respiration. Now, one of the products of that is called pyruvate. And that's going to help go into the Krebs cycle to continue with cellular respiration with oxygen. If we have no oxygen, we know, as we talked about earlier, that we're going to get alcohol fermentation. So we're going to get alcoholic acid or lactic acid. If cellular respiration with oxygen happens, we will get, from the Krebs cycle, 2 more ATP. And some of those products will also go in. Remember, we are bringing in that pyruvate. We're going to produce carbon dioxide, and then it's going to move into the electron transport chain where oxygen's coming in. And in the presence of oxygen, those molecules coming off of the Krebs cycle here are going to produce 32 ATP. And that's where we get that huge chunk of ATP from, but notice it can only happen with oxygen present, that this oxygen has to be there in order for us to get that from the electron transport chain, and a product of that will also then be the water that we get. This should be what your final image looks like, and that is the end of the notes.